Ich darf Sie alle sehr, sehr herzlich im Museum Haus Konstruktiv begrüßen. Ich freue mich, dass Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind. Und ich freue mich auch, dass ich heute einen ganz besonderen und tollen Gast bei uns habe mit Marc Spiegler. Vielen herzlichen Dank fürs Kommen, lieber Marc. Wir haben ja im Programm angekündigt, dass wir heute den Vortrag in Englisch halten. Deshalb werde ich auch gleich auf Englisch umswitchen. Das war die Sprache, auf die wir uns geeinigt haben im Vorfeld. So I repeat to you, very nice welcome again to Museum Haus Konstruktiv. I'm very happy that you are all here tonight. We had with, as it is in the Artworld, we met with Marc on several occasions, and at some occasion we started to talk about the fact that the museum will be 30 years, or is 30 years, in December this year. So we started to talk about the age of 30. Because for me it is very weird that my museum is younger than me. So that was the first handicap which made me, I had to get used to it. So by now I'm starting to get used to it, and I try to make a program where we think about like many things around our heritage, which is the constructivist and concrete and conceptual art. And then we also talked about the fact that we are a private museum. And so from a private museum and collection, we started to talk, we got to the topic of 30 years of museum and 30 years of the art market. So, and I was very, very happy when I asked Marc if he would be willing to do a lecture about the art market and about his thoughts, because he has, of course, the best experience we can imagine. So I was very happy that you accepted, and thank you very much again for coming. I will do a very small reading of his CV, which is probably quite useless because you know him already, but let's do it very officially. So we, like when I first got your card, it read Global Director, and it's very interesting to have a global director, and it represents also that the institution behind is a global institution. And that's also what the name says, because Marc Spiegler oversees the global development of the organization of Art Basel, and we know all by now that there are three locations. We talk about Basel, we talk about Miami Beach and Hong Kong. Marc Spiegler has joined Art Basel firstly as a co-director in 2007, and he became director in 2012. And this was a very interesting time for those of you who know Art Basel longer than that. You will recall that this was actually a time when Art Basel became more and more a global platform for leading international galleries. And I also want to point out that especially in the last few years, Art Basel has developed further worldwide projects such as, and this was seen last year, there was a crowdfunding initiative in partnership with Kickstarter. And I didn't know about it, but I read it today for the first time, that they have also developed a course for emerging collectors. And this course was realized in collaboration with Hong Kong University and the Central St. Martin's in London. So you can see that this global means a lot in many different levels. Before joining Art Basel, Marc Spiegler was a journalist for 15 years, writing about the art world and magazines, for magazines and newspapers such as, we have here the Art newspaper, we have Monopol, Art and Auction magazine, Art News magazine, then die Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and the New York magazine. And just for those who don't know, he studied political science and journalism in the United States and in England. So you see, this is a very interesting CV and a wide-ranging CV, and I'm very curious to hear your talk tonight. And I actually pass you over. I don't have to pass you, you have a microphone. But thanks very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sabine. Thank you, Sabine, and thank you for the Haus Konstruktiv team who's pulled together everything that we will, all the technology I'll be using. I hope most of you can see the screen because I pulled together what I think are some interesting images. It's actually amazing. I was thinking today that this is the first speech I've given in Zurich that was publicly accessible. I've given a few private forum speeches, but the last speech I gave was the first speech I ever gave in a sort of public forum, and it took place not in a museum, but actually in an apartment building that was about to be destroyed, where two friends of mine had set up a lab. And it was actually along a similar topic, and it was the question of the relationship of artists to art fairs. I also realized, much to my dismay and much too late to decline the invitation, that I'm actually far too inexperienced to give this speech, in the sense that I started really being actively involved in the art world in 1996. So I'm hoping that there are some older people here who can give us some historical perspective when we get to the comments. And I'm not a big believer in giving a very long lecture. I always speak a little bit longer than I promised, but I would love for you to gather some questions and comments for the end of the discussion, because I'd like to have an open discussion about this. So, 3 decades that transformed the art world, from a quiet village to a chaotic cosmopolis. Just to set the pace for those of you who might not even have been alive in 1986. 1986, 3 important things politically. The Single European Act is signed. We see how that's developed. Mikhail Gorbachev introduces Glasnost and Perestroika. Microsoft Corporation holds its initial IPO. So if you think about it, a lot of things that are very much in the news now, but in a very different context, were started then. To imagine a world without Microsoft and without the notion of the European Union is kind of interesting. Pop culture, I could have done many things, but I thought I'd have aliens on the Pet Shop Boys. Now you're going to start having flashbacks to all sorts of terrible wedding parties where you were forced to listen to the music of my youth. But let's move on to art. All of these works are from 1986. I think what's interesting is you have Warhol, in a sense, before he was Warhol, and Damien Hirst before he was trying to be Warhol. You also have Barbara Kruger, very much who she is now, and then Salome and Marcus Oehlen, who at the time were the heat of the market in Germany and worldwide, at a moment when Cologne was still very much the central place, and where Art Cologne was still the greatest art fair in the world. It's interesting, looking back and I was walking around the Whitney Museum on Saturday, and I came across a piece which, purely by coincidence, happens to be from 1986. And it's a piece that I wrote about many years ago when I had a blog called Artworld Salon. And the piece is called Talent. And it's pictures of artists, who the artist David Robbins, who's down here in the right-hand corner, asked to do headshots, the classic headshot that in the old days, a movie star would circulate, or not, a potential movie star would circulate in order to get work. And what's so interesting about it is the mix of people, because at the time that he took it, these were all people who were at a relatively equal level, equal currency within the New York art world. And you have people here like Jenny Holzer, here, Cindy Sherman, Alan McCollum, Jeff Koons over here, looking actually not that much different than he does now. But then you also have people like Peter Nagy, who was an artist at the time. The market collapsed. He moved to India and actually set up the first great gallery for Indian artists. Or you have people like Gretchen Bender, who unfortunately has died in the meantime, and was long forgotten, and then suddenly last summer was resurrected by a great show at the Schinkel Pavilion in Berlin. And I'm happy to say that same work will be coming to Art Basel for Unlimited this year. So it's interesting how, if you had looked at this picture 2 years ago, you would have said, "Who's Gretchen Bender?" And if you look at her a year from now, she'll have been on one of the art market's greatest stages. So it's interesting how people disappear and then come back within the art world. But as a rule, they disappear. I'm not going to do a lot of Art Basel, but I thought I would start my research in the easiest possible way, which was to pull out a copy of the Art Basel catalog from 1986. This is before Art Basel became defined by the words Art Basel and the glyph that never goes away. And I did an interesting and actually somewhat melancholy-causing exercise, which was to go through the list of exhibitors and to see how many of them are still here. The exhibitors that you can see, I guess you can't, can you see that? There's not many, there's like 6, are the ones that are still here, and that's kind of cheating. There are 26 out of the more than 300 galleries that are still operative, and that's including galleries that have now split up or that were sold into other hands. So The Art Basel of 1986 is a completely different Art Basel than what you would have now, even though there are galleries that have existed for 40 years, 50 years, et cetera. But it's a world that churns, and it was already churning at the time, but I think that churns even faster now. We also did, and I have to thank JRP Rangier's graphics team, thank you Clément and Eleanor, for helping me out with this. This is a map, and I'm just going to have to point this out to you because it's hard to see. I can barely read it from here. But what's interesting here is if you look at the countries, and the larger the circle, the better the country is represented. You have Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy, Austria, which is basically Art Basel's home country and the 5 countries around it. What's surprising is that the United States is over here, if you think about today's art world. This is what it looks like now. The United States is here. The United Kingdom is there. Switzerland is here. And interestingly, I think, you have countries like Romania, Tunisia, the United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, who are in there. I mean, what we see is the way that power has shifted and the way in which the art world has globalized. And I happen to think that's incredibly interesting, Of course, I also have the pleasure of and the luxury of traveling around and seeing all these different scenes. But even when you see them in a fair, you see how different these galleries are from each other. This is another chart from the yearbook that we put out every year, and I think it's another example of how much the art world, or how globalized the art world is and how globalized Art Basel is. Again, it's hard, I know it's impossible to read, but basically every one of those circles is a city where we have at least one gallery taking part in at least one of our 3 fairs. And as Sabine pointed out, one of the big shifts that was happening around 2011, 2012, 2013 was the fact that we went to Hong Kong. And believe me, before that, most of these galleries wouldn't have been over here. But the fact that we're now interacting with all of these different galleries is quite interesting. And I think it represents, and I think this is one of the last Art Basel slides I'll show you, because I'm not here to promote Art Basel. You all know about it. You're probably all going to come in June. But I think it's an interesting, it's a fundamental shift that we see happening in the art world. Because in the old days, the art world basically was NATO. It was Western Europe and North America. And anybody who was traveling back and forth between those 2 continents on a regular basis and visiting shows could feel like they were up to date on what was going on in the art world. That being said, if you dig into it a little bit deeper, the way that the art world has evolved from that time to now is not so, it's not as globalized as it looks, or it's globalized in ways which vary quite a bit depending on what you're looking at. For instance, if you look at the auction capitals, where the big sales are happening, where the big deals are happening, it's basically still New York, London, Hong Kong, financial capital. So if you talk about the most commercial part of the art business, it's still, okay, Hong Kong is there, but basically it's still very, very, very centralized and very, very, pretty much mostly in the West, because what's happening in Hong Kong for the most part is Asian sales. So basically Western sales happen in New York and London, and the Asian sales happen in Asia. On the other hand, if you go another level down, if you look at art fairs, it already starts to be a little bit more spread out, right? And I would say that one of the things that drove this was Art Basel Miami Beach. When Art Basel in 2002 went to Miami Beach, the notion that you could bring an art fair to another place, and then the way in which the fair brought galleries and artists and collectors from all over the world really spurred a broader interest in fairs, and I think it changed the way that people think about fairs. And I think it's not just about moving it to another place. It was going to Miami Beach, I think, was the final push in an evolution, not only of how Art Basel was evolving, but also how art fairs were evolving and how people's thinking about art fairs was evolving. Because if you think about what Art Basel was and what all fairs were until about the mid-90s, they were basically like the old, they were just like the farmer's market that you would have. There's a space that you rent and you bring things, and the people who want to buy things buy them. So it's basically only of interest to the buyers and the sellers. And what happened in the mid-90s and really was pushed forward by Art Basel and Miami Beach was this time where there was a broader notion of what the fair was. That the fair went from being a sales platform in the halls to being a week in a city. And if you were the organizer of a fair, whether it was Art Basel in Miami Beach or any other fair, Frieze quickly followed suit, for example, when it launched a few years later, you were responsible not only for what was happening within your halls or within your tent, but what was happening the rest of the week. You were responsible for what was happening for from dawn to dusk. You were working with the institutions, you were working with the museums to provide an entire week for the people who were there, who were your guests in a sense. And as a side note, I think, if you look at what Art Basel is today, because we went to Hong Kong, because we've gotten so involved with various digital initiatives, we're now even pervasive beyond just the 3 weeks and beyond just the 3 fairs, and we're really an entity in the art world every single day of the year. But in general, I think there's this fundamental shift, this notion of what a fair is, has also changed who comes to a fair. I mean, there was a year, Alana Heiss, who was the founder of PS1 in New York, famously once said that she would fire any curator of hers that she caught at an art fair. By the time this started, Alana was working with Sam Keller and the Art Basel team to do installations on the beach as part of the fair. And that was a shift that had happened. And I think there's no, if you go to Art Basel, if you go to Frieze, if you go to FIAC, you'll see museum directors, you'll see biennial curators, you'll see artists. And I think that's reflective of the fact that it's not just the buying and selling that's happening at fairs anymore. It's the general meeting of the art world. In the same way that you also have it at a biennial. A slightly different group of people comes to a fair, to a biennial, to an auction room, but you'll see a lot of crossover. And I think it's partly also reflective of the fact that the art world is so spread out, and we need to meet together and exchange ideas and build networks. Continuing this, and I think it's not unrelated, the fact that you have fairs that were functioning as a place where you could meet collectors from other places also meant that you could have galleries in a much broader range of places. So this is where, if you look at where the gallery centers are, right, much more spread out. Right? It's a much more spread out field. You have real gallery centers in places like Dubai, where I'm going next week, for example, has 4 galleries that have been in the statement sector of Art Basel in the last 2 years, and they are all within a distance which is basically the size of this room. I don't think there's any place in the world where there are so many galleries who have done statements that are so close to each other. So Dubai, of all places, but also Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Delhi and Mumbai, Sydney, Beijing, etc. So the point is that I think in a broad way, if you go along the spectrum from the most commercial to the least commercial parts of the art world gets more and more and more globalized because you don't have to be in a place where all the money is all the time. And I think that's actually great. I think what it means is that artists can choose to live in the places where they think they'll produce the best. It also means that you can set up a gallery that has a real role, that you're not setting up a gallery in a place that has 1,000 galleries. You're setting up a gallery in a place where you can really drive the culture forward. And I think this is something that's made possible not only by art fairs, but also by the internet, cheap airline travel, Airbnb, Uber, etc. So moving on, I think one of the things that's always fascinated me is if you look at where the major biennials are, most of them are in places where you really don't have an art market, Sydney has somewhat of an art market. Gwangju in South Korea certainly doesn't have an art market. Kassel is a place that most of us go every 5 years, but only every 5 years. Venice is a great place for contemporary art during the biennials. Interestingly, also during the architecture biennials, as I realized last year. Then you have Sao Paulo and New York. But I think what's really interesting about the biennials is actually what makes them work is the fact, as I would say with Art Basel, in Basel, Hong Kong, and Miami Beach, that you're not surrounded by the market. You're there in a place where you're really focused on the biennial. And another point, as I was saying before, if you look at where artists are, it's all over the map. And actually, I realized just now, I should have added Detroit, where a lot of artists have moved recently because of the cheap real estate and the progressive cultural politics. But the point is, again, you don't need to live in Paris, live in New York, you don't need to live in London in order to be an artist who has a real market there. I mean, what's interesting in the States right now is how many artists are moving to Los Angeles, which on the one hand is becoming more, it's actually very interesting because first the artists moved there because the weather is good and the real estate is cheap and you can have a huge atelier and then you're farther away from the market. And what's interesting now is that so many galleries are moving there as a way to stay closer to their artists. But the point is that I think, you can be an artist in places, like Vancouver, or Bogota, or Jakarta, or Cape Town, or Egypt. And you can have a fully fledged international career, and that's unimaginable 30 years ago. It would have been, you had to be, first of all, there were very few working artists, and there were also, working artists in the sense of like artists who could only work as artists, in comparison with today. But then also you just couldn't be globally present, globally active. And you were very much stuck within your market in the sense that if you happened to be someone who wanted to make expressionist painting at a time when everybody wanted figuration, you just had to wait until the market shifted. On the other hand, if you're someone, trends shift and they're not all the same in every place. So basically, if you want to do expressionist painting, then, and if you find the right gallerists, they will find the collectors in 6 different parts of the world who will allow you to continue making it. So you're not, I think that's another great aspect of a globalized market, that you really have, that the artists can find the places where they want to produce, but then their gallerists can find the places that will allow that production to happen. Last but not least, also interesting, I think, I have one more map for you. What's interesting also is if you look at where the major new museums are growing up, obviously you have things like the Broad and the Whitney in the United States, but then you have Inhotim in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, you have Qatar, you have Doha, and you have Abu Dhabi, you have M+, you have a whole collection of private museums, which I'll get to in a second, and then you have the Museum of Old and New in Tasmania. And what's interesting is this question of like, why are there suddenly museums erupting in places where there doesn't seem to be much of an art world altogether? And I think that's because here I think probably Bilbao was one of the driving forces, the notion that you could have a museum and that it would attract culture around it and would attract people around it. And that's reflective of how much more popular art has become. And I'll get to that again. I'm sort of doing a lot of foreshadowing in the process of this. The development of new museums, of course, is related to where the new collector bases are. And obviously, the old collector bases are up here and up here. But if you look at the new collector bases, they're places like the Middle East, China, Australia, Brazil, Colombia, etc. And I think these stars are actually a little bit over-exaggerated. Michelle Santos, who heads our VIP team, and I know very well that still the overwhelming majority of the collectors are coming from Europe and America, but the overwhelming majority of the new collectors, percentage-wise, are coming from these other places. And a lot of them enter the game very quickly. They take huge steps forwards, and they build museums within a few years of actually starting to collect. I actually met somebody last year who built his private museum in 798 district in Beijing less than a year after buying his first piece. And for this, not that everything comes back to Basel, but I think the Byler Foundation, which opened in 1997, and the Schaschl, which opened in 2003, really kind of set the tone. The notion that if you had a world-class collection, which these certainly are, or if you thought you had a world-class collection, which we'll see in some other cases, some other private museums, you didn't necessarily have to give it to the public institution that was there. And I think, I assume there are a lot of people here who deal, I see some museum trustees in the front row, a museum director. It's really interesting, the dynamic right now between public museums and private museums. And we shouldn't forget that a lot of the public museums, started as private museums. MoMA was not a public museum from the beginning. Private museums can become public, but the point is, right now, the general trend is for collectors to buy with the vision of building a museum where the work they love will be displayed, not stored in someone's basement to be studied by art historians, and where only the work they love will be used. I mean, and it's a totally different notion of what collecting is. I was talking before about the Museum of Old and New in Tasmania, started by a gambling baron. Then there's the Youth Museum from Budi Tech in Shanghai, which opened quite recently. Budi Tech is an interesting figure, and I think it's not in the 30-year evolution, but more in the recent evolution of the art world. I think one of the key events was when Budi Tech, who is an Indonesian of Chinese extraction, who made his fortune, among other things, in poultry, bought this work. It's a Fred Sandback piece that was sold, that was at Art Unlimited. The reported price was $500,000, and the fact that an Asian collector was buying a piece from one of the real greats of that period of minimalism at Art Basel for a significant price was seen by a lot of people as indicative of where things were going. It made us look like geniuses because we had just bought the Art Basel, the show in Hong Kong, and obviously what it proved is that the Asian collectors were certainly ready to go into the Western art. But I think it's, and it's been interesting to watch as that develops, that we see more and more, in the same way that we see a lot of European collectors exploring Asian art, we see a lot of Western collectors who are coming in, or Asian collectors coming into Western art. One of the key figures, Swiss figure, Uli Sig. Uli, of course, famously, when I was a journalist, I met Uli through family connections, and I really pushed him. I was like, we should, you have the greatest collection of Chinese contemporary art. You should, I would love to write about it. Can I come and visit? And he was very reluctant. And when I finally got a chance to write about it, we talked, and he said, I said, who are the other great collectors of Chinese art? And he said, I wish I had more competition. And of course, within a few years, he did. But what's interesting is at the time, Uli was able to buy work that was just sitting around getting destroyed. And he bought a lot of work, even work he didn't necessarily personally like, in order to save it. I mean, he was really trying to capture and save the history of Chinese contemporary art. What's interesting is, as a counter-trend to what I was talking about before, Uli's work is going to the M+ Museum in Hong Kong, which is a public museum. So it's too easy to say the public museums are over, the private museums are where collectors are sending things. But in general, I think this question of the private museum, I think, is going to be one of the defining issues and one of the defining shifts from the last century to this century. One of the major private museums, of course, that opened in recent time was in Qatar, which is a segue to my next slide. Who knows who this is? Philippe Segalot. Learned the ropes from Marc Blondeau, a Geneva dealer, or now a Geneva dealer, at the time a French dealer. And Philippe Segalot was hired in 1996 by Christie's, and he rapidly revolutionized the market by doing something which actually doesn't sound very revolutionary at all now, which is auctioning work by artists, by contemporary artists, that was less than 5 years, or that was 5 years old and not 10 years old, because there was a notion at the time that an auction wouldn't touch something that was more recent than that. And of course, this shifted incredibly fast. And I remember distinctly in 2005, end of 2005, the moment where the traditionally auction houses, and this is shifting again recently now, but traditionally, Impressionist and modern work was sold 1 week by Christie's and Sotheby's, and then the following week, post-war and contemporary work was sold. And traditionally, the first week, of course, was much, much bigger because the old masters were there, and the Renoirs were there, and the Impressionists were there. And then the second week would be more recent material. And then in 2005, it totally flipped. And that was because the market for contemporary art had grown so much bigger. And the new people coming into the field were only interested in contemporary work. And you had this phenomenon over and over of people whose families had collected perfectly, precisely, for many, many decades, old masters, putting it all into auction and buying contemporary work. and sort of ending the family tradition, not of collecting, but of collecting a particular period. So this trend towards the contemporary grew, this notion of how young something had to be before it went to auction grew stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, in the sense that now it's very common, if you pick up a sales catalog, catalog for a sale, that you'll see work which is a year old, 2 years old. In some cases, came straight from the artist's studio. And I think there was a period, and it seems to have ended now, where abstraction, especially abstraction by young men, and especially abstraction that wasn't actually painted, but somehow or other the canvas was manipulated using various processes, some of them mysterious, some of them straightforward, to create something which was not officially a painting, but which actually looked exactly like a painting, an abstract painting on your wall. And the fact, what's interesting about this is, it's Bloomberg News writing about, the sales of very young artists. And for those of you who can't read, it says Lund, and this is Israel Lund's painting sold for 1,500 gain as art flippers return. For those of you who don't know, flipping is the practice of buying work with the pure intent of selling it at as high a profit as possible. In this case, 1,500%. This, I think, has been one of the things that has rapidly transformed the art market, in the sense that I think people who used to wait for an artist to have developed a real track record often want to buy the artist as young as possible, as early as possible. I don't happen to think it's a very healthy trend. I think it burns out a lot of good art. A lot of artists who could have had great careers end up having very short careers, because by the time they're 30, they're kind of burned. They're burned out from overproduction, and their market is burned out from having been pushed too hard. And everybody has 3 paintings, and nobody can sell them, and nobody wants to buy them. And I think it's a very dangerous thing, but I'm not sure how to control it, because it ties in also to the general speed and the focus of youth of our culture today. One of the most distinctive figures and defenders of flipping is Stefan Simkowitz. Some of you who saw maybe some of you have seen the video of a speech I did in Barcelona. I thought I would spare you the picture of Stefan in his underwear for a picture of him with a large umbrella. But I think what's interesting about Stefan Simkowitz is he does, he's someone who comes from an art collecting family, and he's very aggressively, very energetically tried to rethink, the role of the dealer, of the advisor, et cetera. And he's worked very closely with young artists, gathered a lot of material, promoted them either individually, either by finding gallery shows for them, or by dealing directly to a broad range of collectors who other people don't have access to, because he's managed to build a group of people who are, people from Silicon Valley, people from the entertainment industry, people from the sports industry, who don't have a relationship with traditional galleries, but are very happy to trust Stefan about what's good. The other thing that's interesting is the extent to which his rise, and there are many like him, reflects the way in which things have changed. This is the classic portrait of the dealer, Ernst Beiler, on the phone. If you think about what Ernst did, in a time when basically there was the phone, but there was no fax machine, where, jet travel was such a rarity that people would dress up for it, et cetera. This is the classical notion, and I think it's a notion that a lot of people still have. When you look at the evolution away from that, I think one of the big things, one of the inflection points, was in 1995, the launch of ArtNet, which had been around for a while, but this is when they went online. And I think this was really the first platform where people started to trade art digitally, and where galleries experimented with this. And obviously, the thing that does is it makes what you have for sale globally available to anyone who has an internet connection. And what's interesting is the extent to which that's developed, but also the extent to which it still remains a business where people will tend to only buy work of artists that they know, often from a series that they know, ideally from a gallerist that they know. Because in the end, it's a huge risk to buy a work, especially an expensive work, from someone you don't know without being sure what the quality is going to be like when you actually see it in the flesh. Another inflection point, who knows what this is? Yes, it's a dog and it's a woman's sandal. This is the first picture ever posted on Instagram. In 2010. Think about how little time ago there. That was when there was one user, you know? And what's interesting is, you know, if you look at the classical dealer of the time, you know, and now you have Hauser and Wirth's Instagram account. You know, the fact that a major international gallery with major international artists is promoting them. Now, I'm sure that Instagram is only a very, very small portion of the way in which Hauser and Wirth reaches out. But what's interesting is if you talk to younger gallerists, it's a big deal for them. They will reshoot photographs to make sure that they look good on Instagram. And they will communicate heavily. And I think what's interesting about it is, you know, it causes a tendency towards square art. But also, I think what's interesting about it is that it speaks a little bit to the same dynamic that makes St. Moritz successful as a destination for galleries. And the reason it works is because people are receiving, as a gallerist, people are receiving the art you're putting out there in a moment where they're not feeling defensive, where they're not feeling overburdened. It's a moment of repose. And it's mixed in with other images from their friends. And I think, you know, what's striking to me is if you talk to younger gallerists, especially younger gallerists who are selling work which is not super expensive, the impulse buying that will happen, you know, that people will just see it and they'll be like, hey, I want one. You know, and like there are deals which are being transacted entirely over WhatsApp and Instagram. I mean, I wouldn't over-exaggerate this, you know, but I think it is something that is really there. And what it points to is the next part of my speech, which is the rising popularity of art. You know, you cannot underestimate how much bigger, not just the core of the art world is, but the core of the art-interested world is. One example, in 1996, the top 10 museum exhibitions had a total attendance of 4 million people. 8 years later, it was more than double that. You know, the number of people who go to museums, the number of people who go to museums like the Tate, you know, like MoMA, is amazing. You know, and the new museums are all built to accommodate immense crowds. And it's not just because they also hold weddings as a way to maintain their budgets, but it's because on a weekend they will really be inundated with people. And not just on a weekend. If you go to MoMA on a Thursday afternoon, it's amazing how many people are there. You know, likewise, another statistic, a couple years ago, the number of visitors to American museums was 850 million, which was almost double the total attendance of people at Major League sporting events and amusement parks combined. So when we say that we're living in a Philistine culture, it's not quite true. You know, there's still, you know, museums are still things which people go to. They still have, you know, and I think especially the ones, and I think it's really interesting if you talk to museum directors, which I do a fair amount, how much emphasis they're putting not just on their shows, which is still very important, but also on things like, you know, education, you know, reaching out to their audience before they've even graduated from elementary school, or their future audience, I should say. And also things like social media, you know, that it's important to be out there, to be in people's minds. And I think, you know, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Met is just about to put everything they have online. You know, several museums are doing this. There are several initiatives where people are taking a photograph of every single piece in their collection and putting it online with no rights on it, you know. And there's just this idea, before the idea was like, we own it, we're going to control it, we're going to make you pay copyright on it. And now there's this notion that you cannot promote your museum too much. And I think what's interesting is, you know, when I talk with my team about ways to promote our shows, I always have to remind them that there's actually a limit to how many people will fit in our halls. And that for the people who pay for most of the, who pay for most of what's happening, which is to say the gallerists, a completely jam-packed hall is not what they want. What they want is a hall full of interested people. But for museums have a totally different metric. And the metric for most museums is the number of visitors. And so for them, there's basically an infinite possibility in terms of promotion over social media, reaching out over educational groups, et cetera, et cetera. one of the things that the rising popularity and the rising prestige of the art world has made possible, or has pushed forward, I should say, is the involvement of corporate sponsors. I'll start with a couple of our own. This is the Unlimited Hall. I'm sure many of you recognize it, the 100-meter-long Carl Andre. What's interesting is that this would have been completely impossible without the support of UBS, because these halls are incredibly expensive, and Unlimited is subsidized, in a sense, by the sponsorship of UBS. And so from a very early stage, when the fair directors had this notion of doing this huge project, it was the involvement of the corporate sponsor that made it possible. This is one example. A much more recent example, and I see some people in this room who actually worked on this, is the BMW art journey. BMW traditionally had been a supplier of cars, although it was one that had a great involvement with the arts, because they have a strong corporate collection. They'd done cars with many of the great artists of the various eras in which they've been doing it. But also, they came to us and said, we want to do something that's more than just car related, and they said, we talked to them a lot about it, and they'd said, we don't want to do just another artist prize. And in the end, BMW said, we're a company that's defined by movement. And we realized that journeys are an essential part of the way in which artists are inspired. And so basically they came up together with us, working very closely, with the concept of the BMW art journey, which is one in which at the two sectors, the youngest sectors of both the Hong Kong show and the Miami Beach show, a jury of museum directors and curators chooses three great projects, or their three favorite projects, and then the artists are asked to propose a journey. Basically, no holds barred, So the first journey was by the winner of the BMW Art Journey Prize in Hong Kong, Samson Young, a Hong Kong artist, whose focus was on bells. And the reason why bells are interesting to Samson is that bells, in times of peace, or times of war, the bells were melted to make cannons, and in times of peace, the cannons were melted to make bells. And so his project was, using the resources made possible through the sponsorship of BMW, to go all over the world and to measure various bells. And it's a project, we don't know what the result of it is, and it isn't like you must produce a result by this time. But this is an interesting example of how, companies want to get involved in the arts, and not just by putting a logo on the wall and having a lounge where they receive their clients. A riskier engagement was that of Takashi Murakami with Louis Vuitton. I'm sure some of you have one of these bags. Many of you have a fake one of these bags. What's interesting is the extent to which this had no negative impact on Murakami's career. In fact, if anything, it made him better known. And it played perfectly into where he was coming from. But I think there's a long, long history of artists trying to do commercial deals and failing completely. And it really being sort of not the start of something new, but really the signal of the end of their importance. I think, again, the fact that Vuitton would reach out to Murakami, who wasn't the most famous artist of the moment, but just someone who they thought they could work with, and it proved to be very, very successful for both sides, I think is indicative of the fact that working with a corporation is not seen as necessarily selling out, and that both the corporation, if it's willing to play the game, and because I'm sure that when they first presented this the prototypes for this bag to the Vuitton team, it wasn't met with unanimous approval, So I think the company has to be willing to work with the artists on their own terms, but also the artists have to be able to negotiate what's still a very, very tricky terrain. And I think there are many, many more examples of people mishandling this situation, artists mishandling this, than there are successful examples. But there are successful examples, A lot of what I've talked about has been sort of a negative direction in terms of what we think about the classical, of where the art world was. It used to be better. It was a quiet village. Now we have, too many artists crashing too early, too many auctions. There are too many fairs for everyone to go to, too many biennials, lawsuits all over the place. I'm not a big fan of what I call good old days thinking, and I was looking through my bookshelf in my preparation for this, and I came across something. The answer, for those of you who can't see, it's le plus ça change. So le plus ça change, le plus ça reste le même. And I came across a great passage in Janet Malcolm's profile of Ingrid Sishi, who was one of the key figures of 1980s New York, a driving force within the New York art world for many decades. And it's a really great picture of the New York art world in 1986. And what I loved about this, and the reason why I bring it up, is because there's this page-long rant by the art historian Barbara Rose, which includes things like, there are few artists who are intellectuals, but most artists have become professionals. They're like cloak and suitors. They make this product, it's a thing they do, it's not about the agony and the ecstasy or whatever anymore, it's middle class, it's bourgeois. Now that's all the artists want to do, to be invited to fancy restaurants and discotheques. And there are all those people from the suburbs. How do they get a foothold in Manhattan? They get involved with art. So what's interesting about this is you could hear exactly the same thing being said by people today, looking back to the 80s as the great moment when the art world was still pure and clean. And I think we always have to avoid the tendency to look backwards and think that everything was great before because we see some negative signs around us. I mean, the reality is, fundamentally, I'm optimistic about where we are in the art world. I think we're in a place where there are many more artists, there are many more galleries, and there are many more possibilities for the artists and galleries. You know, there are many more museums than there were, and as many speculators as there may be in the art world, there are also many, many, many more patrons of the arts. And I can say that from experience, having met them all over the world. I'll stop on that note. I have no idea if I ran over time, but anyway, I'm happy to take questions or comments. We have a microphone, and now I need questions.
Yeah, we do have a microphone. So first of all, thank you very, very much. I think it was really a great overview of quite a lot of subjects coming in from all the sides. I do have a question, but I would like to give you the chance first to have the question put. So is anybody sitting on a question which needs to come out?
Or a comment. I would love someone
yes.
who lived that 30 decades and sees it completely differently.
I would like to ask about the boom they call in the market boom the art today that is maybe is going to explode.
The short answer to your question is no, but I'll give you a more detailed answer. Over the years, as a result, this 30 years would be a very good example because you had very strong markets in the late 80s and not so much in the early 90s, and then it went very strongly again, and then it dipped a little bit in 2001, and then very strongly in 2000 until 2008, the Lehman Brothers era, and then very strongly now, and then now we see some corrections. But what's interesting is if you're following my hands, the trend is up. And the reason is because there are more and more people interested in art. There are still, if you think about this, the metaphor I often use is, people often talk about a bubble, or this kind of expanding balloon. But at the core of this balloon, there are people like the people in this room, people who care about art, people who like art, people who collect art. And that core is expanding all the time. So that when the balloon retracts, that core keeps it. And then it starts to grow again, and the balloon, of course, is what you see. But inside is this kind of lead core of people who are solidly interested in art. And I think Harold Falkenberg, who's one of my real idols as a collector, once said to me, Mark, good markets make bad art, and bad markets make good art. And so I think, in a sense, if a lot of art which is not that great is not being sold for crazy prices, it's not the worst thing ever. I mean, there are a lot of smart collectors who see a moment like this where some people are stepping back as the perfect moment to step back in. They will look for the artists that they were missing. They will look for the pieces they were missing when they don't have to compete with a lot of people who are just basically trying to decorate their walls or flip something a month down the road. But the short answer to your question is it's not going to explode. I mean, I was just in New York last week, and there were many, there were 3 fairs at the same time. There were many, many galleries who were walking away happy. At the same time, I think the general economic situation is different than it was a year ago, and that's going to be reflected in the market. But I mean, if you look over time, here's something to think about. Most people who can afford a luxury car have one. few people, very few people comparatively, who can afford to collect art are collecting art. And so I think, although you will have setbacks, the general trend for the last 40 years, really, 50 years even, has been that there are more and more people who are considering to buy art. And I think there's this tipping point within a market. And I think America is a good example. I think for many, many decades, if you bought art, most of your friends would see you as someone who didn't understand money and basically were crazy. I think that's finally shifted, but it's still not to the point that you have in places like Germany or Belgium where if you're not collecting art and you have the means to do so, people wonder what's wrong with you. And I think, obviously you can be supporting theater, but the notion that a cultured person is involved with art is not as widely spread as it could be. But I think it's spreading more and more and more places. I think what's interesting is if you watch the dynamic of what happened in Latin America and what's still happening in Latin America, but also what's happening in Asia, it starts with one person who, for whatever reason, gets involved with art. And then their friends come along because they travel in groups. It's not, whereas Europeans or Americans or North Americans travel with museum groups, the Latin Americans travel with their friends. And the fact that their best friend is going to Miami Beach, let's say, for our show, means that they'll come along. And they also have the means to buy art. And then suddenly when they see their friend being featured in a big spread in the Financial Times, they actually say, oh, wait a second, maybe that's actually serious. And I think what's amazing is the extent to which all it takes is one pivotal collector in a region to drive things forward. Sorry, that went far beyond your question, but... Another question, another comment?
Sort of a follow-up, do you think the underlying reasons why people buy art have changed in the past 30 years? And if so, how and what is the effect?
Okay, first of all, I think there's only one kind of person who buys for one reason, and that's a speculator. Right? The speculator buys work they don't like or might not like simply because they see it as an asset class, and they have an idea that in 18 months they'll sell it for 3 times what they bought it for. Most people who collect art, who are collectors, have a mix of reasons. I think, and it's a different mix in every person. You see, there are those who are just trying to be surrounded by beautiful things. There are those who feel like collecting art will connect them to contemporary culture or to historical culture. There are those who feel like this, it will challenge them intellectually, And then there are those, and Harold Falkenberg, who I spoke about before, is a good example, or Uli Sig, for example, who buy art they might not even personally like because they think it's important. Either because they think it's important to support that artist in that gallery, or in the case of Uli, because they think it's important to conserve this work, which is sitting under the roof in some godforsaken Chinese town, getting going to -10 in the winter and going to +20 in the summer. But I don't think it's fair or reasonable to think that there's only one. I think most collectors have a range. What I will say about collectors is I don't know any collector who only collects art. They all have some other thing that they collect. It's a character trait, And it's actually a very funny conversation. If you think like Bruno Bischofberger, who's a great gallerist and great collector, also has an amazing collection of prehistoric arrowheads, and amazing Swedish furniture, and amazing Italian glass, and probably some, Patrizia Sandretto, a good friend of mine, has a great foundation in Torino, but she has an amazing collection of brooches. And inevitably, when you ask a collector, what else do you collect? There's always an interesting answer. It's because I personally don't have this character trait. I collect friends and I collect stories, but I don't need to own objects, But some people do. A lot of people do. Thank God for the artists and the galleries.
There's no general shift in the reason why people...
Is there a shift? I think what you see is the same motivations but spread across a wider group. Obviously, the fact that more people recognize contemporary art means that there are more people who can impress their friends because more of their friends will recognize that it's, a Wade Guyton on their wall, At the same time, I think the fact that more and more people have really dove into art means that there are more of these altruistic collectors who buy things because they think it's important for their region, for that movement, for that artist. You know, times change, technology changes, but human psychology doesn't change that much. I mean, at some level, we're still all back in the caves.
I think we have a time-wise, the last question here. And after this question, you also have one? Okay.
I'll keep my answer shorter.
Let's take yours
Listen,
as well.
questions in Switzerland are so rare that I'm going to answer both questions.
Okay, so let's take
I'll take all
questions.
questions and I'll keep my answers to less than a minute.
And then we change to bar questions. Because
Bar questions.
Our bar
I'm also
is
available
open
at the bar.
And we all know that it's much easier to talk at bars.
Yes.
So I found very interesting what you said about trust in the market, and but you at the same time spoke about expansion and the digitalization, let's say, of the market. So what is today, based on your experience and your knowledge, how can you trust your partners in business, let's say?
I fundamentally believe, and it's not just because I lead art fairs, that you can do a lot of work with people digitally, but it's a lot easier if you've met them face to face. I mean, in that sense, I was saying we're still in the caves. You still have to see someone, smell them, judge their body language, see how they answer questions. And then you can do it all over email. It's like we have teams, we have team members in New York, we have team members in Florida, we have team members in Hong Kong, we have team members in Basel. I'm not even talking about the more than 20 people we have spread all over the world who are VIP representatives. We come together at least once a year. And then you can do a lot over email, over Skype, over conference calls. And I think it's the same in the market. I think in the sense that if you've seen the work of an artist in person, you can judge your emotional response to it. It's much harder. I fundamentally believe, and this is from talking with many collectors, that the work they tend to like the least over time is the work they found the sexiest at first. It's the stuff that looks good on a screen, but it doesn't necessarily have a lot of depth. And so I think an intelligent collector often will reserve a piece that they haven't seen, but they won't actually buy it right away. This is why you see, and also smart galleries won't sell it right away. This is why you see people running into Art Basel and other fairs. It's not because they want to see the dealer first. It's because they have a 30-minute reserve on a work, and they need to see it. And the gallerist won't sell it to them until they've seen it, because they've had too many cases where someone returned something, and the smart collector won't buy it. So I think we're not in a commodities business. We're dealing with unique objects, unique people, unique galleries, unique artists, and I think in that sense, the physical, the personal still remains true. But as an accelerator, as a builder of momentum, and as a creator of a sort of after effect, long tail effect, the digital is amazing.
I just wanted to say that I'm a collector for many years. I was with Uli Zig in that time, and I went to China, and the world was quiet, and there was nobody out there, and we were in this amazing moment in time, and that's every collector's dream, to somehow, by chance or accident, fall on amazing artists. And you were at that place. And there's nothing more exciting in the world than that. Yeah. I just want you to know it's still possible. You have to go out, you have to be hunters and look for them. And when you find them, it's very, very exciting. Yeah. And it'll broaden your life. And what I do miss at the fairs is trans avant-garde, when you had the big movements and Basel would show them. Mm-hmm. And that's dispersed through the world now. Yeah. And so it's harder to find those movements. I miss that.
I think I know what you're saying in the sense that it used to be that the whole world came together in one or two places, and that everything that was important was gathered there. I would argue that we're actually in a post-movement moment, or actually it's more than a moment. I feel like there are trends, but things don't disappear. They just sort of go in the shadows and come back. But it's much, much harder to point to any distinct movement right now. The only thing I would point to would be, for instance, the advent of finally a real generation of young digital artists who work as easily with the digital as they do with painting.
Thank you all very, very much for joining. Thank you very much, Marc.
Thank you.
And I think some remaining questions may be asked at the bar. We are still open at least till 8. I think we're going to run a little bit longer today. Thanks very much for coming. Bye.